I used to think the safest place in my life was the space between familiar people. The ones you've known long enough that you stop questioning them. The ones you trust so completely that you don't even realize trust is something you're giving. Now, I don't really have that anymore. It's strange how something can disappear without physically leaving. The same routines still exist. The same phone sits on the counter. The same morning light comes through the blinds. But the feeling that used to live inside those ordinary things, it's gone. There was a version of my life where I belonged somewhere. Where I had a role I didn't even think about. Husband. Friend. The steady one. And then, without warning, I became someone else. Someone who double-checks silence. Someone who hears laughter differently. Someone who understands that betrayal doesn't always come like a storm. Sometimes it comes like a door that closes too softly for you to notice until it's already shut. I still catch myself reaching for things that aren't there anymore. A sense of certainty. The comfort of assuming I knew the people closest to me. That's the part one still can't get over. Not just what happened, but how long it was happening before I saw it. Because the truth is, I didn't uncover anything through some dramatic confrontation. There wasn't a screaming match or a confession that suddenly made everything clear. It started with something small. So small that even now, I feel almost embarrassed calling it the beginning. It was just a moment. One of those moments you'd normally forget as soon as it passes. I remember standing somewhere familiar, surrounded by noise and celebration, watching people smile the way they do when they think life is simple. I remember feeling relieved, like maybe things were finally getting lighter again. And then I noticed something. Not a fact. Not proof. Just discomfort. The kind that slips under your skin before your mind can explain it. It was a look that lasted half a second too long. A pause in conversation that didn't belong. A feeling that I had stepped into a room where something had already shifted, even though everyone was still acting normal. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking. I was tired. Stressed. Distracted. I wanted to believe that was all it was. Because noticing is dangerous. The second you notice something, you can't unnotice it. And once you start paying attention, you cross an invisible line. Before that line, you live in assumption. After it, you live in suspicion. I didn't want to live there. I didn't want to be the kind of person who questioned the people I loved. So I swallowed it. I laughed when everyone else laughed. I smiled when it felt expected. I played my part. But somewhere underneath, something had cracked. Not enough to break yet. Just enough to let the cold air in. That's what I keep thinking about now. How betrayal doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as a whisper. Sometimes it arrives as a feeling you try to ignore because accepting it would mean admitting your life might not be what you thought it was. And maybe the hardest part is knowing that the moment everything changed wasn't even the moment I found out. It was the moment I realized I might have to look. That's where the fracture really began. Not with certainty. With hesitation. With the smallest instinct telling me something was wrong, and the quiet choice to pretend it wasn't. If you've ever been there, standing at the edge of a truth you're not ready to face, you already know how heavy that kind of silence can become. And if stories about trust, betrayal, and the moments that quietly undo a life speak to you, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who understands how complicated people can be. Because this wasn't a story about strangers. This was about the people I trusted most. And the night I first felt something shift, was only the beginning. Something was already slipping away, even though I didn't know what it was yet. Before everything fell apart, my life felt settled. Not perfect. Not like some movie where everyone is always smiling and saying the right things. But steady. Predictable in a way I used to take for granted. I had people. Real people. The kind you don't have to impress anymore. One of them had been in my life for so long that I stopped thinking of him as a friend and started thinking of him as something closer to family. We met years ago, back when everything was uncertain and we were both still figuring out who we were supposed to become. The bond formed the way those early bonds do, through long nights, shared stress, inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else. He was there when I had nothing but ambition and a cheap apartment. I was there when he lost direction and needed someone to remind him he wasn't alone. Over time, it became automatic. If something good happened, he was one of the first people I told. If something went wrong, I didn't even have to ask, he'd show up. That kind of history does something to your brain. It convinces you the person is permanent. Untouchable by doubt. Trust stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like gravity. And then there was my relationship. The person I married wasn't someone who swept into my life dramatically. It was quieter than that. More gradual. The kind of love that grows through repetition. Small things. Shared meals. Falling asleep on the couch. Arguments that ended in apologies instead of silence. We weren't reckless. We weren't impulsive. We built something carefully, like we were stacking pieces and checking each one before placing the next. That was what I believed, anyway. In the beginning, it felt safe. She had a way of making ordinary days feel less heavy. Even when life got busy, even when stress piled up, I thought we were still on the same side of it. And I was proud of that. I liked being the steady one. The dependable one. I liked thinking that no matter what changed in the world, the core of my life was solid. What I didn't realize back then was how much of my identity was wrapped up in that solidity. Being the husband who was trusted. Being the friend who was loyal. Being part of something that couldn't be easily broken. The three of us existed in the same orbit more often than not. Not constantly. Not in some forced way. But enough that it felt natural. Shared dinners. Group plans. The kind of comfort where nobody has to explain why they're there. I never questioned it. Why would I? They were two separate pillars in my life, and I believed they stood independently. I didn't see how closely they were positioned. How easily one could lean into the other. Looking back, I can admit there were moments where I felt, almost lucky. Lucky that my life had aligned in such a clean way. A partner I trusted. A friend I trusted. A sense that I wasn't doing life alone. There's a specific kind of peace that comes from thinking you've already found your people. And once you believe that, you stop looking for cracks. You stop imagining alternatives. You stop preparing for loss. That's what trust does. It makes you soft in places you don't realize are exposed. At the time, I would have told anyone that betrayal wasn't even a concept that belonged in my life. It was something that happened to other people. Other relationships. Other stories. Not mine. Not with them. That was the foundation I was standing on. And I didn't know yet that foundations don't always collapse with an earthquake. Sometimes they erode quietly, while you're still living on top of them, convinced everything is fine. And the scariest part is that when it finally breaks, you realize it was weakening long before you ever felt it move. I didn't notice the shift right away. If someone had asked me back then whether anything was wrong, I would have said no without hesitation. Life felt busy, not broken. Complicated, not unstable. That's how it starts, I think. Not with alarms, but with excuses. Work demanded more of my attention. The days felt shorter. Conversations became more practical than emotional. How was your day? Fine. Tired. We'll talk later. Later became a habit. At first, I told myself it was normal. Relationships settle. Passion evolves. You trade intensity for comfort. That's what people say, right? And I believed it. She was still there. Still present in the ways that counted, or so I thought. We shared space, shared responsibilities. We still laughed sometimes, still made plans. But something had changed in the texture of things. The pauses between conversations felt longer. Her attention seemed divided, even when we were alone. I started filling in the gaps without being asked. Handling more. Saying less. It felt easier than pushing. I didn't want to be the one who complained. At the same time, my friend became more present. Not intentionally. Not in a way that would have raised alarms if I'd been looking. He checked in more often. Asked how things were going. Made time when I didn't ask for it. At first, it felt supportive. Familiar. Like the kind of loyalty I'd always counted on. There's comfort in having someone who knows you without explanation. So I leaned into that. Without realizing it, I started unloading there instead of at home. Nothing dramatic. Nothing inappropriate. Just venting. Frustrations about work. The feeling that things felt off, even if I couldn't explain why. He listened the way he always had. Calm. Attentive. Sometimes he'd reassure me. Things go through phases. You two are solid. I trusted him when he said that. Maybe more than I trusted my own instincts. Looking back, I can see the imbalance forming. I was investing emotional honesty in one place while maintaining emotional quiet in another. But at the time, it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like survival. At home, I didn't want to add pressure. With him, I didn't feel like I had to. That's how dependency sneaks in. Not as desire. As relief. Meanwhile, she seemed lighter. Not happier exactly. Just less weighed down. She laughed more easily when we were around other people. She had energy that I hadn't seen in a while. I told myself it was a good sign. That maybe the rough patch was passing. That maybe I'd just been overthinking. I didn't ask many questions. I didn't want the answers to complicate things. Instead, I focused on being useful. Present in the ways that didn't require emotional risk. Making sure things ran smoothly. Being the stable one. The irony is that stability can create distance. When you become predictable, people stop checking in. They assume you're fine. I can't say when the lines blurred, because they never clearly did. There was no moment where boundaries were discussed or crossed out loud. It was all unspoken. Shared time. Shared concern. Shared understanding. Three people connected by history, comfort, and proximity. No one acknowledging the weight of it. If I'm honest, part of me felt grateful. Grateful that the people I loved seemed to get along so well. Grateful that there was harmony instead of tension. I didn't see that harmony can hide imbalance. That closeness without awareness can turn into something else entirely. I thought emotional safety meant absence of conflict. I didn't realize it can also mean absence of attention. By the time I sensed something was off, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt dull. Like something slowly draining without spilling. And that's the dangerous part. When nothing seems wrong enough to confront, but nothing feels right enough to ignore. I was still standing on that foundation I trusted. I just didn't realize one side of it was starting to carry more weight than it was meant to hold. And once weight shifts quietly, it rarely shifts back without consequence. The first warning signs didn't look like warnings. That's what makes them hard to name. They weren't obvious. They weren't dramatic. There was no clear betrayal written across anyone's face. It was just little things. Small moments that didn't belong anywhere, but also didn't belong nowhere. A tone shift. A glance. A pause that felt slightly too deliberate. The kind of details you only notice when something inside you is already listening for them. I remember one evening when we were all together, sitting in the same familiar space, talking about nothing important. The conversation moved easily, like it always had. And then she laughed. Not unusual. Not suspicious on its own. But it wasn't the laugh that caught me. It was the way he looked at her afterward. Just for a second. Like he was waiting for something. Like he'd heard something meant only for him. I told myself I was imagining it. Because what else was I supposed to tell myself? That two people I trusted completely were sharing something I wasn't part of? No. That thought felt ridiculous. So I swallowed it. A few days later, she mentioned his name in passing, casually, like it meant nothing. But it came up more than it used to. Not constantly. Just enough that I noticed. He said this. I ran into him earlier. He's been stressed lately. It sounded like concern. And concern is normal. Friends care about friends. Still, something about it made me feel outside. Like I'd missed part of the conversation. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be insecure. I didn't want to be that guy. The one who sees shadows everywhere. The one who turns harmless friendships into accusations. So I kept quiet. The unease stayed. It would come and go. Some days I felt ridiculous for even thinking about it. Other days, it sat in my chest like something unfinished. Then there were the absences. Not the kind you can point to and say, "Where were you?" More like emotional absences. She'd be in the room but not really there. Her phone would light up and she'd turn it slightly away without thinking. Not hiding. Just angling. Like instinct. Again, nothing concrete. Nothing I could accuse. But instincts don't need evidence to exist. They just exist. I started noticing how often he offered help. Too eager sometimes. Too available. If I mentioned I was busy, he'd step in. If you need anything, let me know. I can take care of it. It sounded like loyalty. But loyalty has a shape. And sometimes it starts to resemble something else. I found myself watching them without meaning to. Not spying. Just observing. Trying to reassure myself that I was wrong. That everything was normal. That I was just stressed. The problem is, reassurance doesn't work when your body already feels the shift. There was one moment, small enough that I almost forgot it, but sharp enough that it stayed. We were all standing together, and she brushed past him in a narrow space. Their shoulders touched. Accidental. Harmless. But neither of them moved away quickly. It was half a second. Maybe less. But in that half second, something tightened inside me. Like my brain had taken a picture without my permission. Later, I remembered thinking, why did that feel like something? And then immediately feeling guilty for thinking it at all. That was the cycle. Notice. Doubt. Dismiss. Shame. I became trapped in it. I didn't want to believe my life could contain that kind of story. I didn't want to believe I could be standing in the middle of something I didn't understand. So I did what people do when reality starts to feel unstable. I acted normal. I kept showing up. Kept smiling. Kept trusting. But trust had started to feel like a performance. Not because they had changed completely. But because I had. Once suspicion enters, even quietly, it changes the way you see everything. You start replaying conversations. You start wondering what you missed. You start hearing silence as information. And the worst part is that you don't even know if you're being paranoid or perceptive. You just know you don't feel safe anymore. Not fully. Not in the way you used to. By the time I reached the moment where everything broke, I wasn't looking for betrayal. Not consciously. I was just trying to quiet the discomfort. Trying to prove to myself that the fracture I felt wasn't real. But discomfort doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It just waits. And it was waiting for me. I didn't plan to find anything. That's the part that still feels surreal. I wasn't searching through messages. I wasn't following anyone. I wasn't preparing myself for a confrontation. I was just moving through a night the way people do when they believe they're still inside their normal life. There was noise everywhere. Voices overlapping. Music in the background. The kind of atmosphere where nothing feels sharp because everything is blurred by celebration. I remember thinking, for a moment, that maybe I'd been wrong about all of it. Maybe I'd let stress distort my perception. Maybe the discomfort had been nothing. People were smiling. Glasses clinked. Someone called my name and I nodded automatically, even though I didn't really hear what they said. And then I noticed she wasn't. At first it didn't feel strange. People move around. Conversations pull you in different directions. You lose track for a few minutes. So I waited. I assumed she'd be back. I told myself not to overthink. But minutes passed, and something in me started tightening again. That familiar, quiet tension. I looked across the room. I didn't see her. I checked near the hallway, thinking maybe she'd stepped out for air. Nothing. It was such a small thing, but it hooked into that unease I'd been carrying for weeks. The feeling that something was always slightly out of frame. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Still, my feet moved. Not urgently. Just, instinctively. I walked down a corridor that was quieter than the main space, the sound of laughter fading behind me. The air felt different there. Cooler. Still. I remember the way the carpet muffled my steps. I remember thinking, this is stupid. She's probably just talking to someone. Then I heard it. A laugh. Her laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even unusual. But hearing it away from everything else made it stand out, like a thread pulled from fabric. It came from behind a door that wasn't fully closed. Just slightly open. A thin line of light spilling through. I stopped. For a second, I didn't move. I don't know what I expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe I just wanted to confirm she was okay so I could go back and pretend I hadn't wandered off like this. My hand touched the door before my brain caught up. I pushed gently. Not forcefully. Not like someone about to expose a secret. More like someone entering a room they believe they belong in. And then the world rearranged itself in a single frame. It wasn't dramatic at first. My mind couldn't process it fast enough. Two shapes too close. Her body angled toward someone. Arms where they shouldn't have been. For a fraction of a second, I honestly thought I was misunderstanding what I was seeing. Like my brain tried to protect me by mislabeling reality. Then my eyes adjusted. And recognition landed. It wasn't a stranger. That was the part that made it feel unreal. If it had been someone unknown, maybe my mind could have filed it under chaos. Mistake. Randomness. But it wasn't random. It was someone familiar. Someone permanent. Someone who wasn't supposed to exist in that space with her like that. My chest went cold. Not hot. Not angry. Cold. Like my body had shut something off to keep me upright. Neither of them spoke immediately. There was a pause where time stretched thin. I saw the moment they realized they weren't alone. Her face changed first. Not into guilt exactly. More like shock. Like she couldn't believe the door had opened. Like she couldn't believe I was real. He stepped back, but too slowly. As if part of him still hadn't accepted that the moment was over. No one said my name. No one rushed toward me. No one explained. There was just silence. And in that silence, everything I'd built my life on collapsed without making a sound. I didn't scream. I didn't ask why. I didn't do anything that people imagine they do in that situation. I just stood there. Frozen, not because I was calm, but because my brain couldn't find a script for what I was seeing. It felt like watching my own life from outside my body. Like I'd walked into the wrong room and discovered I didn't know anyone inside it. Her lips moved slightly, like she might speak. But whatever she was about to say didn't matter. Not in that second. Because the truth was already there, heavy and undeniable. Trust wasn't broken. It was gone. Erased. And the worst part was the clarity. That instant understanding that nothing could return to what it had been, even if they begged, even if they explained, even if I wanted it to. Something essential had been taken before I even knew it was at risk. I took a step backward. Not as an exit. More like my body trying to put distance between me and the moment. Between me and the version of myself who still believed in permanence. I didn't know what I was going to do next. All I knew was that I could never unsee what I'd just seen. I don't remember walking away. I know I did, because the room behind me disappeared and eventually I was somewhere else, but the actual movement feels blank in my mind. Like my brain refused to record the transition. One moment I was standing in that doorway, staring at something I couldn't name without it becoming real. The next, I was in a hallway that felt too long, too quiet. My hands were shaking, but not violently. More like a subtle tremor, as if my body was trying to wake itself up. I could still hear music somewhere in the distance. That was one of the strangest parts. Life was continuing. People were laughing. Glasses were being filled. And my world had just split open in silence. I made it back to a place where no one could see my face for a second. I leaned against a wall and tried to breathe. I remember thinking, this doesn't make sense. Not because it hadn't happened. But because it didn't fit into the story I believed I was living. Footsteps approached. I looked up. She was there. Her expression was unreadable, like she hadn't decided what emotion to wear yet. Behind her, he appeared too. Keeping distance, but not leaving. That alone felt like another violation. As if he still belonged nearby. She spoke first, voice low. Please, can we talk? It was such a normal sentence. That's what people say when they spill something, when they drop a glass, when they misunderstand. Not when they destroy you. I stared at her. I wanted words, but my mouth felt disconnected from my thoughts. Finally, I managed something simple. How long? She blinked. He shifted slightly. Neither of them answered right away, and that hesitation was an answer in itself. It's not what you think, she said quickly. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was automatic. The most predictable line in the world, delivered in the least survivable moment. I looked at him then. My friend. My brother in everything but blood. He opened his mouth like he wanted to speak, then closed it again. His eyes wouldn't meet mine for more than a second. That hurt more than any apology could have. Because it meant he knew. He had known. I didn't mean for you to find out like that, she said. Find out. Like it was information. Like it was a surprise party gone wrong. My chest tightened. So there was a plan, I said quietly, almost to myself. She flinched. He finally spoke. Listen, it just happened. That word. Happened. As if betrayal was weather. As if loyalty was something that slipped on accident. I felt something inside me start to crack into anger, but it didn't come out clean. It came out exhausted. You don't just end up there, I said. My voice sounded strange to me, like someone else was speaking through it. She reached toward me instinctively, then stopped, like she wasn't sure she was allowed. I was lonely, she whispered. That landed differently than I expected. Not because it excused anything, but because it made everything messier. Lonely. As if I had failed without knowing it. As if the distance I'd sensed was suddenly my fault. I shook my head. Why didn't you tell me? She looked down. He looked away. The silence stretched again. I realized then that whatever explanation they offered wouldn't restore anything. Even if it was emotional. Even if it was brief. Even if it was a mistake. It had crossed into something permanent the second it involved the two people I trusted most. I felt exposed. Like my entire life had been happening in a room with a door slightly open, and I just walked in. People passed at the far end of the hallway, unaware. Someone laughed loudly. The sound felt obscene. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I asked him, because I needed to hear it. Was I ever your friend? His face changed. Pain flickered there, real or performative, I couldn't tell. Of course you were. Then how? I said. He swallowed. I don't know. That was the closest thing to honesty I'd heard. I realized then that I wasn't going to get clarity tonight. Only damage. Only fragments. She started crying quietly, like that could soften the reality. I didn't comfort her. I couldn't. I didn't even hate her in that moment. I just felt hollow. Like something had been scooped out of me and replaced with air. I stepped back. I can't be here, I said. She whispered my name, but it didn't reach me. I walked away before I could change my mind. Because staying meant listening. And listening meant letting them shape the story of what they'd done. Outside, the night air hit my face, sharp and real. I stood there alone, realizing that whatever happened next, nothing I trusted would ever feel the same again. The days after blurred together in a way that still feels unreal. People expect aftermath to be loud. Explosive. Full of dramatic decisions and final words. Mine was quiet. Too quiet. There were conversations, of course. Messages that went unanswered. Apologies that arrived too late and felt strangely rehearsed. Explanations offered in pieces, like if they were careful enough, they could control how much damage the truth did. I didn't push for details at first. Part of me didn't want them. Part of me was afraid that knowing more would make it harder to breathe. But truth has a way of surfacing whether you ask for it or not. It came slowly. Indirectly. Through slips in conversation. Through inconsistencies that didn't line up unless you followed them backward. A comment that contradicted an earlier explanation. A timeline that shifted depending on who was talking. I didn't think it mattered. I assumed you already knew. It wasn't serious then. Then. That word kept appearing. As if there had been a version of betrayal that didn't count yet. What I learned, piece by piece, was that the moment I walked in on wasn't the beginning. It was the point where secrecy stopped working. There had been conversations before. Emotional ones. Moments framed as support. As concern. As harmless closeness. Lines crossed quietly. Then recrossed. By the time I noticed something was wrong, they had already decided what they weren't going to tell me. That realization hurt more than the image itself. Because it meant my instincts hadn't been paranoia. They'd been late. I hadn't imagined the distance. I hadn't misread the looks or the pauses or the way the room felt different. I'd felt the truth pressing against the surface before I had proof. And instead of trusting that feeling, I'd talked myself out of it. That's a hard thing to sit with. Not just that you were betrayed, but that you abandoned yourself first. There was no moment of triumph in realizing I'd been right. No relief. Just a dull confirmation that my life had been quietly rerouted without my consent. They both expressed regret. In their own ways. She cried. He apologized. Promises were made about understanding, about mistakes, about growth. I listened without interrupting. Not because I was moved. But because I needed to hear how they understood what they'd done. What I realized was that regret doesn't always come with accountability. Sometimes it comes with justification. Loneliness. Confusion. Proximity. None of it changed the outcome. None of it gave me back the version of myself that trusted without hesitation. Somewhere in the middle of all that processing, I want to pause and say this: if stories like this resonate with you, if you've ever questioned your instincts or lived through a betrayal that didn't announce itself, take a moment to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment. These stories exist because a lot of people carry pain they don't know how to name. By the time the dust settled, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns fast. What replaced it was heavier. Clarity. The understanding that some relationships don't explode, they decay. And by the time you see the rot, the structure is already gone. I didn't get closure. I got confirmation. And I'm still learning how to live with the difference. I've spent a long time trying to understand what actually broke. It would be easier if I could point to a single moment and say, that's where everything went wrong. But the truth is, the ending was only possible because of a series of quiet choices that felt harmless at the time. That's what stays with me now. Not just the betrayal itself, but the way it grew in the absence of boundaries. I used to believe trust was about loyalty. About never crossing certain lines. Now I think it's also about awareness. About noticing when closeness starts replacing honesty. About speaking up when something feels off, even if you can't explain why yet. Looking back, I don't see villains the way I once did. I see people who didn't stop themselves soon enough. People who mistook comfort for permission. People who chose the easier silence over the harder conversation. That doesn't make the damage smaller. It just makes it more complicated. I've replayed my own role more times than I can count. The moments I stayed quiet. The times I chose peace over curiosity. The way I trusted consistency instead of intuition. I don't blame myself for what they did. But I do recognize how much I relied on the idea that trust, once earned, doesn't need maintenance. That belief cost me. What I lost wasn't just a relationship or a friendship. It was a version of certainty. The kind that lets you move through life without second-guessing the people closest to you. I don't live that way anymore. Now, I listen more closely to discomfort. I ask questions sooner. I don't ignore the quiet signals just because acknowledging them would be inconvenient. Some people might call that guarded. I call it awake. So here's the question I keep coming back to, and maybe you will too. Is betrayal always about desire and intention? Or does it begin much earlier, when someone chooses emotional closeness without honesty, and the people involved decide not to name it? At what point does silence become participation? And how much responsibility do we have, not just to be loyal to others, but to be honest with ourselves when something doesn't feel right? I don't have a clean answer. I only know that trust isn't lost in one moment. It's given away slowly. Often by everyone involved. And once you understand that, you don't walk through relationships the same way again.